Anyone familiar with the Primarchs shouldn't be surprised by the statement that not all of them are maybe the most mentally healthy people in the galaxy.
Are you ready to go crazy?
I'm already hearing voices!
Are you ready to...
Smart, Patrick, do you mind?
Now, when I say mentally ill Primarch, the first person who comes to mind is obviously going to be Konrad Curze, and honestly he does deserve his own video. But in this one, I want to talk about Lorgar, everyone's favorite preacher turned demon worshipper turned Ravenbait, I suppose, if GW ever gets back to that piece of lore. Now, before we get into it, I would like to ask you to please subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so, and thank you so much for watching this video. Also, I want to give a massive shout out to my friend Acid Key Lime, who was a huge help in making this video and getting my thoughts lined up, as well as being so informative. The reason I know what I know about the condition I'm going to be talking about in this video comes from a webtoon called Noises in My Head, chronicling experiences with this condition, as well as just generally raising awareness. And it's beautifully drawn, I have to say that. So, if you do have webtoon or Twitter, go ahead and give some support and show some love. But enough stalling and back to the video. And, specifically in this video, I want to put forward my theory, or, well, not really a theory, more my interpretation as to what exactly is going on with Lorgar mentally. Now, I should note before we begin, I have done as much research as I can because I did want to be thorough, and I've reached out to people who know a lot more than me on the topic, but I myself am not a psychologist. However, I did take one psychology course back in my first year of university almost 10 years ago, and that I do believe does qualify me to talk about this from a solid position of unassailable authority. And I'm going to clarify that that was in fact a joke because I have a bad habit of delivering things so deadpan and so straightforward that people don't realize I'm being sarcastic. Anyway, I do believe, judging by all the evidence and everything I've read, that Lorgar does exhibit a lot of the traits of borderline personality disorder, or BPD. Now, the thing about BPD is that it is a very stigmatized mental illness nowadays. Now, it might not seem like it, but it should be noted that every so often, the public consciousness will pick a mental disorder or some kind of condition to really demonize and latch onto as sort of a boogeyman disease. Back in the day, they used to make up terms like hysteria, and then there was a brief period where ever-smoking pot was called like reefer madness, and then there was psychosis was one. And do you guys remember that period of time where there was a big public panic about schizophrenics? Like, there was this idea that if you went outside and looked at someone the wrong way, they would turn out to be some kind of crazy schizophrenic and would just decapitate you right then and there. It was a big thing back in the day. Maybe some people who are younger than me wouldn't remember, but that was a thing. And nowadays it does feel like disorders like borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder are generally characterized the same way, that people with them are just seen as evil and inherently toxic or like horrible to be around. Because BPD is characterized more than anything by a difficulty to control one's emotions and how that affects their personal relationships. Now, this level of stigma can make it very difficult for people with this condition to seek help or be open with others or even really admit that they have it because of the reactions it can invoke and just generally how it's viewed. Now, the first question to ask is, how does someone develop BPD? Now, this is where you're going to start seeing lines connect between Lorgar and the general diagnosis of BPD. Now, obviously a big factor in determining whether or not someone is going to have one of these conditions is genetic history. And yeah, as previously stated, there is definitely a history of mental illness in the Imperial family. You know, my friend Warhammer Wiki actually released a video effectively diagnosing the Emperor as a psychopath, that being someone who has antisocial personality disorder. Konrad Curze, for his part, is an allegory for schizophrenia, and Angron with the Butcher's Nails is representative of bipolar disorder, usually in how it manifests in men, that oftentimes being in bursts of aggression. However, the most important Primarchs are the ones who show narcissistic traits in this regard, because narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder are oftentimes very comorbid, meaning if you have one, you'll have the other, or at the very least there is a connection there. Now, when you want to talk about that, you can start looking towards Primarchs who display narcissistic personality disorder. Perturabo, for his part, is a vulnerable narcissist, Alfarius does show traits of being a covert narcissist, and Fulgrim borders on histrionics. So as we can see, there is a genetic basis for Lorgar to have this condition. but the single biggest factor in regard to someone developing BPD is a history of abuse. Oh, hi Corferon and Erebus and the Emperor to a degree. Out of all of the Primarchs, Lorgar had probably one of the most abusive parents that adopted him, barring Mortarion. And we can absolutely see the effects of this reverberate through his entire life. For those who want to get up to speed, his adoptive father was a man named Corferon on the planet of Colchis, which was a world basically ruled by a priest caste. No, it was not that kind of abuse. Everyone calm down. Though, jokes aside, he was beaten very severely and criticized constantly, and as such, he pushed himself to do better and better and better and better in order to win the approval of his adoptive father and those around him. And as you can imagine, this is not good for someone. And it wasn't just Corferon. The people around him consistently mistreated him, and even though they did follow him and put him up on a pedestal, belittle him. Now, what this results in is a mentality that fears above all other things failure and abandonment. As such, criticism is seen as a deep personal attack because it's almost like an indictment to failure under any circumstances, even healthy criticism that you get later on in life. Because growing up, criticism was only a bad thing and a precursor to being mistreated or abandoned. Now, as previously stated, people with BPD are known for having a lower level of emotional control, especially in response to negative stimuli. This is the reason, and the driving cause is fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of failure, fear of pain, because they have known so much pain throughout their lives. This is why Lorgar is so wildly reactive. This is stated by Rabute Guilliman himself before the heresy was known. This is touched on in the book Know No Fear by Dan Abnett, which was flatly one of the best books in the entire heresy. If you have not read it, it is so good. Guilliman states, quote, "He is so changeable," Guilliman says. "He's prone to extremes, eager to please, quick to take offense. There is no middle to him. He's so keen to be your best friend, and then, at the slightest perception of an insult, he's angry with you, furious, offended, like a child. If he wasn't my brother, he'd be a political embarrassment and an impediment to the effective rule of the Imperium. I know what I'd do with him." When you have the wider context, this actually makes Guilliman look kind of bad, the way he's talking about Lorgar knowing what we know. But in the book, we do get a solid example of this, because Guilliman says, hey, we're having some interference with our code. It seems like some kind of scrap code came in on your ship. And then Lorgar shuts down the group call to talk to Guilliman personally and says, what, are you trying to accuse us of something? I just got here and now you're giving me all this? Like, he just starts flying off at him. We're gonna ignore the fact that Lorgar actually was sabotaging Guilliman's ships here because he was getting ready for the betrayal at Kolth. But his reaction here is telling, and that's what prompts Guilliman to say this. Guilliman assures him, like, no, dude, calm down. We just thought maybe it stuck to your ship like a barnacle or something, a digital barnacle, basically. Then Lorgar's like, oh, sorry, I'm sorry I flew off at you. Like, this is what prompts Guilliman to say he's so changeable, and this is something you can see with people who have BPD. They're prone to these high emotional extremes, and it can be very, very taxing on both the people around the person and especially for the person themselves, because there's so little stability. But it should be noted that it's not a personal attack, it's all reactive, because it comes to effectively a defense mentality of, I'm gonna get you before you get me, because you're absolutely gonna try to get me, because that's all they're used to. Now, there's been a lot of negative talk here and doom and gloom about that, but there is one thing I want to say that speaks to Lorgar's benefit and is also a truth for a lot of people with borderline personality disorder, and that being, they are often very affectionate and can be very kind and caring, especially when they have a proper support network. There is a quote stating that they love with an intensity not often seen in those without. And I think that's, really touching, especially knowing my friends who do have this condition. And we actually can see this with Lorgar, because out of all of his brothers, he is the one most committed to the ideal that the Primarchs should in fact function like brothers, and not just allied generals for the greater cause of the Imperium. When Magnus and Leman Russ come to blows on a planet in the book 1,000 Suns over their inherent differences regarding sorcery and what should be done with the vast quantities of knowledge this planet has, Lorgar steps in, not for the sake of the campaign, but because he states, I don't want to see my two beloved brothers fighting like this. He really does care about all his siblings. And this can be seen even after the heresy is underway, because Magnus asks him, Lorgar, why are you so concerned with saving Angron? Because Lorgar's basically going on a long con plan to save Angron from the Butcher's nails in his head that are killing him. That's something that he's openly telling Magnus, and it's a very big expedition, because this is the Shadow Crusade across Ultramar. And he says to Magnus, it's because he's my brother. Like, it's not for any wider goal, I just want to save him from dying. And to a degree, he was successful. Kind of. But again, it says a lot to his character. And the one thing I like is that it shows that he's not just evil or well, he is evil, but not this horrible, dangerous person who's going to manipulate and abuse everyone around him. But there are some other aspects of BPD I want to touch on that are incredibly interesting. One of them being the idea of a favorite person. Now, a favorite person could be anyone, be it a friend, a family member, or romantic partner, who a person with BPD latches onto very closely in an emotional way. This can result in a relationship that is very deep and important, but can border on dependent. And this results in obvious problems when the person with BPD could end up in a situation where their favorite person either doesn't care for them as much as they care for their favorite person, or is using them for whatever reason, or doesn't really show them as much attention and affection as they emotionally need. Now, there's an idea that, oh, you're demanding someone's attention and affection, that's toxic, you're just wasting their time and draining them emotionally. Not necessarily. All of it comes down to communication and understanding, and this can even manifest in forms such as physically written boundaries. And there's nothing wrong with needing attention or needing validation or needing that emotional connection with somebody. But it does really come down to whether or not this favorite person can reciprocate. That's why communication is key, and being open with yourself about how you feel and your emotional needs. Lorgar has very strong and specific emotional needs that were flatly not met throughout his entire life. The best example of a favorite person in his instance would be his father, the Emperor. And Jesus Christ, Now, one of the main hallmarks of a favorite person relationship, especially one that isn't really healthy, because they actually can be quite healthy if managed properly and properly communicated, is excessive idealization. They will put that person on a pedestal and view them as just the greatest person ever and shower them with praise. This is very literal in this context with Lorgar, because he literally insists, despite his father's protests, that the Emperor is a god, and continues to erect monuments in his worship, converts planets to his worship, and builds the quote-unquote perfect city of Monarchia for this. And the backlash is incredibly destructive to Lorgar emotionally. Remember those aforementioned feelings of abandonment? Well, when it comes to a favorite person, that is cranked up to 11. So, when Lorgar watches Monarchia be destroyed by his favorite person and his brother, it's not surprising that he ends up locking himself in his room for over a month, weeping and rubbing the ashes of the burnt city on himself, because this is rejection of the highest order to someone who is least emotionally equipped to take it on the chin. And tragically, it's the emotional vulnerability and rejection that Lorgar finds himself in that makes him so susceptible to manipulation and abuse from those around him who would seek to take advantage of him because they know what he's like. That being his adoptive father Corferon and Erebus, someone he views as a close friend and personal confidant. And sadly, this is something that a lot of people with BPD have to deal with. People seeing the emotional state that they're in and how extreme their emotions are and using that to control them or even use them as a weapon. In the book The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, there is a scene that depicts how Erebus and Corferon work to very deliberately take advantage of Lorgar's need for validation and acceptance in order to turn him. There is a scene that is almost hard to sit through because it's so uncomfortable. It is such an uncomfortable depiction of abuse and manipulation, wherein when Lorgar is weeping and just dealing with this rejection, Corferon and Erebus are literally circling him, basically feeding him lies to get him on their side, all the while glancing at each other and smirking back and forth in that way of like, yeah, we got him. And it makes the blood boil. Because what they're saying to him is feeding into his need for validation and his fears. They're saying things like, oh, Lorgar, man, you're so nice. Your real problem is that you're just too caring. But all your brothers, they have real problems. Like, this brother, he's like that. This one's like that. And then he starts getting into it. Starts really vibing with what they're saying. He's like, oh, even Magnus? Oh yeah, even Magnus. What about Gilliman? Oh, Gilliman? Oh, Gilliman's the worst. And using him as sort of the crux for his hatred and his feelings. Because that's actually a very common thing for people with BPD. The feeling that everybody hates them. Especially, it's poignant when Lorgar comes head-to-head in Betrayer with Gilliman. And it should be noted that a lot of people with BPD, when they come out of that deeply emotional state, there's often going to be feelings of regret about how they may have treated people or things they may have said. And Lorgar feels bad about what happened to Gilliman. He realizes in this moment that Gilliman never hated him, that they were real brothers, and that Gilliman is really coming after him on something that could have possibly been avoided. He wants to reach out to Gilliman. He wants to tell him why this is necessary and tell him about the Dark Gods and just explain himself. But he knows that they've come too far to do that, and that bridge has been burned, and it's only going to end one way between them, which is really sad. Lorgar is not like a brick wall of neurosis or just a raging, horrible person. He's hurting, and he is reacting to things as they come based on the way he only knows how. So it's all these factors: the abuse as a child, the genetic history of comorbid mental illnesses like NPD, the emotional volatility, the favorite person, the idealization of that favorite person to unhealthy degrees, the massive subsequent rejection sensitivity, and the susceptibility to abusers that really does paint a clear picture of someone who is struggling with borderline personality disorder. And there's a few more things too, because there is a very tragically high statistic of people with BPD either attempting to or successfully self-terminating. And I say self-terminating, but you know what I mean. YouTube is just like that. And we do even see this with Lorgar at the Battle of Istvan V, wherein he is at the mercy of Corvus Corax and tells him to just end it. He's fully ready for Corvus to just kill him right then and there after having lost the fight. But he is saved at the last moment by Konrad Kurz. Well, saved I say in air quotes, but you know how it is. And the last thing is Lorgar's growth. Because near the end of the Horus Heresy, and afterwards, when he ascends to demonhood, you can see that he actually has grown and his mental health has improved. He's become healthier, oddly enough. Near the very end of the heresy, by the time the book Slaves to Darkness rolls around, you would expect Lorgar to likely have slotted into his old ways of idolizing and worshipping somebody that he gets approval from. In this case, that would be Horus. However, he doesn't do that. He actually questions Horus's actions and disagrees with him, even going so far as to launch a failed rebellion against Horus. And after that rebellion fails and he gets the shit beaten out of him, and is allowed to leave, he gets over it. He doesn't hold that deep, bitter grudge like he did against Gilliman. He takes a breath, accepts what happened, and lets it go, and then just goes on his way with most of his legion. That shows an insane amount of growth on his part. And we can see this mirrored after the heresy, when, after having retreated into the Eye of Terror to the demon world of Sikaris, he, rather than trying to take control of the traitor legions and continue the war, or seize power, or start dividing people, or just being wildly angry and reactive, he goes into meditation and into seclusion for 10,000 years. While the old Lorgar might have reacted wildly to this situation, the new Lorgar decides to stop, take a breather, and just wait. Just breathe rather than react. And furthermore, when he faces down Corvus Corax, he doesn't really have any animosity towards him. He says, "I am not the same person you fought on Istvan." And that, I believe he means. It's not just because he's now a demon Primarch, it's because he's healthier and in more control of his emotions now. Now, he still gets his ass beat like a drum by all means, but it still shows that he is no longer this highly emotional person and is much more collected, which makes him a lot more dangerous if I'm being honest. However, he isn't fully better, because he does still surround himself with his old abusers and maintain some of those old attachments. You know, people like Corferon and Erebus. Also, funnily enough, there's a giant statue to Zardu Laik of all people on Sikaris, You know, Zarduleg being the word bearer who actively sabotaged Lorgar's failed coup against Horus and sided with the War Master and went to Terra to fight, despite Lorgar taking the rest of the Legion away. Someone who should be shunned by Lorgar has a giant statue on Lorgar's own planet. And Lorgar is just completely sanguine with that. He's like, yeah, sure, it can be there. He doesn't really mind. I mean, we don't hear what he says about it, but if he did mind, I'm pretty sure he would do something about it. But now he's just a much more mellow and put-together person who is okay with that statue being there. Lorgar Aurelian, you may be a backstabbing, evil, devil-worshipping unhuman, but I'm proud of you. But what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with my assessment of Lorgar's mental state? Do you guys have maybe experiences having BPD or knowing a loved one who does have it? Do you guys think maybe I'm just reading too much into this, or that Lorgar maybe has the symptoms of a different mental condition? I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below, especially on videos like these where I cover these kind of analytical topics as opposed to just straight lore. And once again, please subscribe if you have not already done so, and a huge thank you to my friend Acid Key Lime for help and insight, and just generally talking with me, and make sure to check out Quoth the Raven. But until then, I will see you in the next video.